Okay, welcome back to week two, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. Last week we made a good start defining some of the key terms of mystery fiction, focusing on detective fiction. And we're going to continue on digging a little deeper today in today's lesson. I'm going to focus on Edgar Allan Poe and his three short stories in detective fiction. So our reading is The Mystery of Marie Roget. And it's often subtitled as a sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which we gave a plot summary of last week. It was written in 1842, and this is the first murder mystery based on details of a real crime. It first appeared in Snowden's Lady's Companion in 3 installments, November and December in 1842 and February 1843. And Poe refers to it as one of his tales of logic. So, a very brief sketch, plot summary. Poe's detective character, C. Auguste Dupin, and his assistant, an unnamed narrator, undertake the unsolved murder of Marie Roget in Paris. The body of Roget, a perfume shop employee, is found in the River Seine, and the press takes a keen interest in the mystery. Dupin remarks that the newspapers create a sensation rather than to further the cause of truth. Even so, he uses the newspaper reports to get into the mind of the murderer. Dupin rejects the popular theory, blaming the murder on a gang of ruffians seen in the area around the time of Roget's disappearance. One of such a group, he reasons, would have certainly confessed to the crime due to the fear of betrayal rather than a bothered conscience. Using the known facts of the case, Dupin further determines that a single murderer was involved. This person was probably a sailor and dragged the victim by the cloth belt around her waist at first, then switched to a cloth around her neck before dumping the body off a boat into the river. Finding the boat, Dupin suggests, will lead the police to the murderer. The narrative is based upon the actual murder of Marie Cecilia Rogers. Rogers was presumably born in Lyme, Connecticut in 1820, though her birth records have not survived. She disappeared on October 4th, 1838 in New York City. Working at a tobacco shop, she was regarded as attractive by the male clientele, and thus became known as the beautiful cigar girl. Only a few days later, the newspapers announced her return. It was said she had eloped with a naval officer. 3 years later, on July 25th, 1841, she disappears again. Her body was found floating in the Hudson River in Hoboken, New Jersey. which is right next to New York City. The details surrounding the case suggested she was murdered. The death of this well-known woman received national attention for weeks. Months later, the inquest still ongoing, her fiancé was found dead, an act of suicide. By his side, a remorseful note and an empty bottle of poison were found. Writing about Rogers as a sequel to the murders of the Rue Morgue, Poe tried to solve the aforementioned enigma by creating a murder story. As Poe wrote in a letter in 1842, under the pretense of showing how Dupin unraveled the mystery of Marie's assassination, I, in fact, enter into a very rigorous analysis of the real tragedy in New York. He situated the narrative in Paris using the details of the original tragedy. Although there was intense media interest in memorializing of a sort by Poe, the crime remains one of the most puzzling unsolved murders of New York City. Fictionalized actual events, especially murder, was common in this period of American literature. Poe had previously fictionalized the so-called Beauchamp shop tragedy in his only play, Politician, which was left uncompleted in 1835. The sensational murder story was also fictionalized by several other writers, including William Gilmore Simms and Thomas Hawley Cheevers. The mystery of Marie Roget, however, was likely the first real-life crime turned into a detective story. Okay, so that's it for this slide, and we will move on. Okay, let's talk about Le Chevalier C. Auguste Dupin. He is a fictional character created by Edgar Allan Poe. Dupin made his first appearance in Poe's 1841 short story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely considered the first detective fiction story. He reappears in The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. Dupin is not a professional detective, and his motives for solving the mysteries change throughout the three stories. Using what Poe termed logic, Dupin combines his considerable intellect with creative imagination, even putting himself in the mind of the criminal. His talents are strong enough that he appears able to read the mind of his companion, the unnamed narrator, in all three stories. Poe created Dupin's character before the word detective had been coined. The character laid the groundwork for fictional detectives to come, including Sherlock Holmes, and established most of the common elements of the detective fiction genre. Let's take a look at the character background. Dupin is from what was once a wealthy family. The title Chevalier means a knight of the royal order. But by a variety of untold events, has been reduced to more humble circumstances and contents himself only with the basic necessities of life. But he doesn't have a job, okay? He has enough money so he doesn't have to work. He just has to be really careful about how he spends his money. He now lives in Paris with his close friend, the anonymous narrator of the stories. The two met by accident while both were searching for the same rare and very remarkable volume in an obscure library. This scene, the two characters searching for a hidden text, serves as a metaphor for detection. They promptly move to an old manor located outside of Paris. For hobbies, Dupin is fond of enigmas, conundrums, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. He bears the title Chevalier, meaning that he is a knight of the Legion of Honor. Dupin shares some features with later gentleman detective, a character type that became common in the golden age of detective fiction. He is acquainted with the police prefect G, who appears in all three stories seeking his counsel. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin investigates the murder of a mother and a daughter in Paris. He investigates another murder in The Mystery of Marie Roget. This story was based on the true story of Marie Rogers, a saleswoman at a cigar store in Manhattan, whose body was found floating in the Hudson River in 1841. Dupin's final appearance in The Purloined Letter features an investigation of a letter stolen from the French Queen. Poe called this story perhaps the best of my tales of logic. Throughout the three stories, Dupin travels through three different, distinct settings. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, he travels through city streets. In The Mystery of Marie Roget, he is in the wide outdoors. And in The Purloined Letter, he is in an enclosed private space. Dupin is not actually a professional detective, and his motives change through his appearances. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, he investigates the murders for personal amusement and to prove the innocence of a falsely accused man. He also owes that guy a debt, too. So he refuses a financial reward. However, in The Purloined Letter, Dupin purposely pursues a financial reward, and a very handsome one at that. Dupin's method is in matters beyond the limits of mere rule that the skill of the analyst is evidenced. He makes in silence a host of observation and inferences. From Gavin Rees, from gavinrees.com, his essay on C. Auguste Dupin states, Edgar Allan Poe is a name that most of us heard at school due to his classic literature fiction. His books are famous all around the world and is well known for his detective short stories. One of the characters Poe wrote about was C. Auguste Dupin, a gentleman living in Paris and by profession a detective. Poe wrote 3 short stories about the detective and include Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, and The Mystery of Marie Roget. the first two being highly successful, while the last one being comparatively less successful. The character depicted a reclusive man who prefers his own company and prefers to work at night in candlelight. He smokes a Mechlin pipe and even has a sidekick just like Sherlock Holmes. Dupin is shown as a character that likes to stay away from the traditional ways of law enforcement, preferring to develop his own techniques in innovative ways to solve the mysteries he is presented with. In the short stories, he believes that the French police way of investigating are stale and unoriginal. He believes the police get distracted by bigger details of the case, forgetting the important finer details. For example, in the first story by Poe, the police were so fixated on the gruesome nature of the double homicide that they forgot to check the windows which hold the clue to the murder. Dupin views a crime scene as a scientist or mathematician by removing his emotions and looking at it objectively. He tries to gather all the tiny details and calculate the moves in the murderer as one would in a chess game. In the second short story, the police do not want to get involved in a political situation, which is why they tiptoe around the whole situation, while Dupin knows that by getting involved, he may be able to figure out exactly how to solve the mystery. Dupin is a well-constructed and even enjoyable character. He has a reflection of the times and may have been a nudge to the police that they need to do better work. His character had some good qualities along with witty comments and humorous moments too. Even Dupin is most appreciated for the new and innovative ways he came up with to deal with mysteries around him. Reading such stories helps the reader realize that the same old technique may not always present a solution to a problem. Also, that innovation and creativity will always get you the best results. Edgar Allan Poe, The Murders of the Rue Morgue. While discussing Dupin's method in the light of Charles Sanders Peirce's logic of making good guesses or abductive reasoning, Nancy Horowitz's first quotes Poe's definition of analysis and then shows how Poe is running the gamut of possibilities here. Inferences, reasoning backwards, visual, sensual, and aural science, reading faces. Playing cards with this man would have been an interesting experience. There is considerable controversy about the philosophical nature of Dupin's method. According to biographer Joseph Crutch, Dupin is portrayed as a dehumanizing thinking machine, a man whose sole interest is pure logic. According to Crutch, Dupin's detective prowess is first exhibited when he appears to read the narrator's mind by rationally tracing his train of thought from the previous 15 minutes. Dupin's method is to identify with the criminal and put himself in his mind. By knowing everything that the criminal knows, he can solve any crime. His attitude towards life seems to portray him as a snob who feels that due to his aptitude, normal human interaction and relationships are beneath him. In this method, he combines his science logic and artistic imagination. As an observer, he pays special attention to what is unintended, such as hesitation, eagerness, or a casual or inadvertent word. Dupin's method also emphasizes the importance of reading and writing. Many of his clues come from newspapers or written reports from the prefect. This device also engages the readers who follow along by reading the clues themselves. Inspiration. Poe may have gotten the last name Dupin from a character in a series of stories first published in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1828, called The Unpublished Passages of the Life of Roget, the French Minister of Police. The name implies duping or deception, a skill Dupin shows off in the Purloined Letter. Detective fiction, however, had no real precedent, and the word detective had not yet been coined when Poe first introduced Dupin. In writing the series of Dupin's tales, Poe capitalized on contemporary popular interest. His use of an orangutan in the murders in the Rue Morgue was inspired by the popular reaction to an orangutan that had been displayed at the Masonic Hall in Philadelphia in July 1839. In the mystery of Marie Roget, he used a true story that had become of national interest. Literary significance and influence. Sherlock Holmes is one of several detectives influenced by Dupin. C. Auguste Dupin is generally acknowledged as the first detective of fiction. The character served as the prototype for many that were created later, including Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and Hercule Poirot by Agatha Christie. Conan Doyle once wrote, "Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from which a whole literature has developed." Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it? Many tropes would later become commonplace in detective fiction first appeared in Poe's stories. The eccentric but brilliant detective, the bumbling constabulary, the first-person narrative by a close personal friend. Dupin also initiates the storytelling device, where the detective announces his solution and then explains the reasoning leading up to it. Like Sherlock Holmes, Dupin uses his considerable deductive prowess and observation to solve crimes. Poe also portrays the police as an unsympathetic manner, as a sort to foil the detective. The character helped establish the genre of detective fiction, distinct from mystery fiction, with an emphasis on the analysis and not trial and error. Breda Matthews wrote, "The true detective story as Poe conceived it is not in the mystery itself, but rather in the successive steps whereby the analytic observer is able to solve the problem that might be dismissed as beyond human elucidation." In fact, in the three stories which star Dupin, Poe created three types of detective fiction, which established a model for all future stories: the physical type, in The Murders of the Rue Morgue, The Mental Type in The Mystery of Marie Roget, and a balanced version of both in The Purloined Letter. Okay, so that's quite a bit on the Chevalier, and we'll move on to our next slide from here. Okay, Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin in The Murders in the Rue Morgue. This is from shmoop.com. Commentary on Auguste Dupin. We're not knocking on Poe's genius by admitting that Dupin isn't fully fleshed out as a character. After all, he's not really meant to be a rounded character. He's most notable for the role he plays in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, for taking the many clues presented during the course of the story and assembling them into a whole. Remember, The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a new kind of story, less interested in depth of character than in engaging the reader in logic games. In other words, The Murders in the Rue Morgue is like a database of evidence: the 3 silver spoons, the 20 or 30 blood-smeared gray hairs, the windows locked from the inside. And Dupin is like the search engine that picks out what we need to know when we can't figure it out for ourselves. Most of the details Poe gives us about Dupin's background and interest seem designed to show us that he's not really great at playing with others. Dupin comes from a great family that's fallen on hard times. This means that he has a private income, but still has to live on a tight budget. As a result, he doesn't have to work for a living, but also doesn't have the social or political obligations of someone from an aristocratic background who still has lots of money. We learn that Dupin spends what little money he has on books, and he and the narrator become friends when they're both looking for the same volume at a library in Paris. We get the sense that Dupin might not be the most social or extroverted of characters. Neither Dupin nor the narrator seem like they belong to a book club, in other words. Dupin doesn't exactly hate other people. After all, he's willing to live with the narrator, and we can't help but notice on the narrator's dime, meaning that Dupin is living off his friend's money. But what he likes, way more than directly interacting with others, is looking at them. He and the narrator never go out during the day, but they love to walk around the Parisian streets at night, checking out the people around them and guessing who they are and where they're from. Why does Dupin keep so separate from the rest of humanity? We think that the key to solving this puzzle lies in his interaction with the narrator. Consider the moments when Dupin suddenly interrupts the silence between them to say exactly what the narrator's thinking out of the blue. He loves watching faces and body language to make deductions, and he values the surfaces of things as the best source of clues for what's going on underneath them. It is this trait that makes Dupin a great detective. He can look beyond obvious clues that confuse the police, and like 4,000 francs on the floor when the police think they have to provide the motive, because who doesn't want lots of money? As we learn, An orangutan, that's who. He sees the small details that indicate what really happened, like the broken nail in the second window frame. But it also makes him hard to deal with as a friend. How would you feel if your best friend kept staring at your face, trying to figure out your feelings, instead of just, asking? He's mostly interested in games, puzzles, philosophizing, and not so much in personal bonding. But, by the way, the last word about Dupin's character. He sneers at the prefect of police, is all head and no body. In his reasoning, he lacks creativity, even though he's got plenty of cunning. But Dupin himself seems to be all brain and no heart. He only gets involved in trying to get Le Bon off the hook because he owes him a favor, not because the guy is innocent. In the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Scarlet Letter, Dr. Watson compares Holmes to Dupin. To watch Holmes replies, "No doubt you think you're complimenting me." In my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomenon as Poe appears to imagine, alluding to an episode in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, where Dupin deduces what his friend is thinking, despite their having walked together in silence for a quarter of an hour. Holmes remarks that trick of his breaking in on his friend's thoughts was an appropriate remark and is really very showy and superficial. Nevertheless, Holmes later performs the same trick on Watson in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. So let's take a look at a video from American Masters, Edgar Allan Poe, Buried Alive, the official trailer from PBS. Okay, let's take a look at Poe's third story, The Purloined Letter. Purloined just means stolen. It was written in 1844. This is from sparknotes.com. In a small room in Paris, an unnamed narrator, who also narrates the murders in the Rue Morgue, sits quietly with his friend, C. Auguste Dupin. He ponders the murders in the Rue Morgue, which Dupin solved in that story. Monsignor G., the prefect of the Paris police, arrives, having decided to consult Dupin again. The prefect presents a case that is almost too simple. A letter has been taken from the royal apartments. The police know who has taken it, the Minister D., an important government official. According to the prefect, a young lady possessed the letter which contained information that could harm a powerful individual. The Queen. When the young lady was first reading the letter, the man whom it concerned came into the royal apartments. Not wanting to arouse his suspicion, she put it down on a table next to her. The sinister Minister D then walked in and noted the letter's contents. Quickly grasping the seriousness of the situation, he produced a letter of his own that resembled the important letter. He left his own letter next to the original one and began to talk of Parisian affairs. Finally, as he prepared to leave the apartment, he purposefully retrieved the lady's letter in place of his own. Now the prefect explains that Minister D possesses a great deal of power over the lady. Dupin asks whether the police have searched the minister's residence, arguing that since the power of the letter derives from it being readily available, it must be in his apartment. The prefect responds that they have searched the minister's residence but have not located the letter. He recounts the search procedure, during which the police systematically searched every inch of the hotel. In addition, the letter could not be hidden on the minister's body because the police have searched him as well. The prefect mentions that he is willing to search long and hard because the reward offered in the case is so generous. Upon Dupin's request, the prefect reads him a physical description of the letter. Dupin suggests that the police search again. 1 month later, Dupin and the narrator are again sitting together when the prefect visits. The prefect admits that he cannot find the letter, even though the reward has increased. The prefect says that he will pay 50,000 francs to anyone who obtains the letter for him. Dupin tells him to write a check for that amount on the spot. Upon the receipt of the check, Dupin hands over the letter. The prefect rushes off to return it to its rightful owner, and Dupin explains how he obtained the letter. Dupin admits that the police are skilled investigators according to their own principles. He explains this remark by describing a young boy playing even and odd. In this game, each player must guess whether the number of things, usually toys, held in the other player's hand is even or odd. If the guesser is right, he gets one of the toys. If he is wrong, he loses a toy of his own. The boy whom Dupin describes plays the game well because he bases his guesses on the knowledge of his opponent. When he faces difficulty, he imitates the facial expression of his opponent as though to understand what he thinks and feels. With this knowledge, he often guesses correctly. Dupin argues that the Paris police do not use this strategy and therefore could not find the letter. The police think only to look for a letter in places where they themselves might hide it. Dupin argues that Minister D is intelligent enough not to hide the letter in the nooks and crannies of his apartment, exactly where the police first investigate. He describes to the narrator a game of puzzles in which one player finds a name on a map and tells the other player to find it as well. Amateurs, says Dupin, pick the name with the smallest letters. According to Dupin's logic, the hardest names to find are actually those that stretch broadly across the map because they're so obvious. This game in mind, Dupin recounts the visit he made to the minister's apartment. After surveying the minister's residence, Dupin notices a group of visiting cards hanging from the mantelpiece. A letter accompanies them. It has a different exterior than that previously described by the prefect, but Dupin also observes that the letter appears to have been folded back on itself. He becomes sure that is the stolen document. In order to create a reason for returning to the apartment, he purposefully leaves behind his snuff box. When he goes back the next morning to retrieve it, he also arranges for someone to make a commotion outside the window while he's in the apartment. When the minister rushes to the window to investigate the noise, Dupin replaces the stolen letter with a fake. He justifies his decision to leave behind another letter by predicting that the minister will embarrass himself when he acts in reliance upon the letter he falsely believes he still possesses. Dupin remarks that the minister once wronged him in Vienna and that he pledged not to forgive the insult. Inside the fake letter, then, Dupin describes a French poem that translates into English: "You are smart and clever, but I am smarter and more clever." So let's take a look at a quick video about the Purloined Letter from Mayberry Book Club. Okay, so let's go with a quick summary of the story you're going to read. We'll bring you along. And the Mystery of Marie Roget from mantex.com UK. So the story follows the formula Poe devised from The Murders in the Rue Morgue. An unnamed narrator presents the hero, Detective Dupin, as a somewhat world-weary bohemian with an outstanding intellect. Dupin is then landed with the difficult problem of a crime which the police cannot solve. The structure of the story then follows essentially two parts: the presentation of the evidence, then the analysis of the facts. Marie Roget disappears, then her corpse is found in the Seine. Everyone is baffled by the problem. Dupin examines all the evidence related to the crime, then speculates on possible explanations. There is a missing third part of the story, which makes itself quite noticeably felt. We don't know if Dupin's interpretations of events is correct or not. He draws up a list of what might be the solutions to the mystery. His conclusion is that further investigations might confirm the veracity of his speculations, but we do not know if these theories are valid or not. That is the major weakness of this story, and the reason why it is not so successful as its companion pieces, The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. But in drawing up his explanations for what might have happened, Poe makes some interesting observations which might throw light onto a secondary subject of the story, which is the character Dupin himself. He has a fresh and original way of looking at evidence. The proper question in this case, such as that it is not so much what has occurred as what has occurred that has never occurred before. He also makes plain a scathing critique of the newspapers and superficial journalism which runs through all of Dupin's stories. Not only are the police incompetent in failing to solve the crimes, but the newspapers merely highlight sensational details to increase their sales. The irresponsible highlighting of these graphic details actually obscures the truth of what really happened in the crime and impedes its solution. This critique of the press irresponsibility was made more than 150 years ago and may be regarded as still valid today. We should bear that in mind in general. It is the object of our newspapers rather to create a sensation, to make a point, than to further the cause of truth. The main problem with this tale as a short story is that it lacks any sense of dramatic movement, and it certainly doesn't have a genuine resolution. There is no active pursuit of a criminal. All activity relating to the crime has already been taken place before the story begins, and we do not know if Dupin's suppositions are valid or not. As the critic Howard Haycraft observed, the characters neither move nor speak. These weaknesses arise from the very origins of the story. Poe wrote the tale when the mysterious crime was still fresh in the public's mind. He also promoted the story as his own original solution to the mystery. It was even published in 2 parts. But the fact is that the crime has not been solved. Indeed, it never has been solved. However, the story does have the distinction of being the first detective murder mystery based on a real-life crime. So let's get into the story a little bit here. A synopsis. Following Auguste Dupin's success in solving mysteries of the murders in the Rue Morgue, his fame spreads among the Parisian police. The attractive Marie Roget lives with her widowed mother, who keeps a pension. Marie works in a perfume shop in the Palace Royal, owned by M. Leblanc. Marie suddenly disappears for a week, then returns home, then disappears a second time, after which her corpse is found floating in the River Seine. The police are baffled. A reward is offered, then doubled a week later. After a month, the chief of the prefecture visits Dupin with a request for help to save his reputation and honor. The narrator then gathers dispositions and newspaper reports of the crime. Her body was badly mutilated. She was interred, then exhumed for further investigation. Public outrage rose as time passed without results. It is suggested that the body might be that of somebody else. An outsider, M. Bravis, takes a close interest in identifying the body. Although a friend of his identifies it sooner. The newspapers throw direct suspicion on M. Bravis, but he protests his innocence. Some boys find remains of clothing in the woods and a handkerchief bearing the name Marie Roget. The landlady of a nearby tavern reports the appearance of a young man and woman. There are screams later. Then the dead body of Marie Roget is found in the same spot, along with a suicide note. Dupin is severely critical of the newspapers and police. He submits the text of one journalist's report to close critical examination and goes into a detailed account of the physics of the bodies drowning in water. He is particularly scathing about the journalistic generalizations, cliches, and sloppy reasoning. Dupin thinks it's necessary to look outside the immediate events of the mystery. He digs up several news reports which at first seem unrelated to the mystery. He analyzes the garments found at the crime scene and argues that they have been planted there. Then he compares the likelihood of a single murderer with that of a gang. So initially, they thought it was a gang of boys who came into a local restaurant, caused a ruckus, didn't pay the bill, ran off. The owner of that restaurant was really promoting the fact that she thought the murder was committed by those gang of ruffians. His analysis of the evidence points to the conclusion that the murderer must have been the sailor with whom Marie Roget previously eloped. He suggests that further interviews could be conducted with this in mind. The narrator concludes with a comparison of the real historic crime of Marie Rogers and then further reflections on chance and possibility. Okay, so that's kind of the overall view of the story, but it is kind of a heavy read. It is a little bit of that old English writing style. So there are a couple of ways to get through this. You can read the text verbatim. There is also an audio component of the story. So if you would rather just listen to the story, that's fine too. Or do a little reading, a little listening, a little reading. But whatever you need to do, just get through it. It is a little heavy this week on the reading end. And we'll talk about that more in detail on week 3. So let's kind of move on here a little bit, and we'll talk about our music piece for the week from Bob Dylan song Hurricane Carter. Okay, let's take a look at our music video, our mystery music video for this week. And it's written by Bob Dylan, and the name of the song is called Hurricane Carter. Okay, so Hurricane Carter was born in 1937 and passes away in 2014. And he was an American-Canadian middleweight boxer who was wrongfully convicted of murder and later released following a petition of habeas corpus after serving almost 20 years in prison. In 1966, Carter and his co-accused John Artis were arrested for a triple homicide, which was committed at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey. Shortly after the killings at 2:30 a.m., a car which contained Carter, Artis, and a third acquaintance was stopped by police outside the bar while its occupants were on their way home from a nearby nightclub. They were allowed to go on their way, But after dropping off the third man, Carter and Artis were stopped while they were passing the bar a second time 45 minutes later. Both of them were arrested. Carter and Artis were interrogated for 17 hours, released, then rearrested weeks later. In 1967, they were convicted of all three murders and given life sentences, served in Rahway State Prison. A retrial in 1976 upheld their sentences, but it was overturned in 1985. Prosecutors declined to try the case a third time after their appeal to the Supreme Court failed. Carter's autobiography, titled The 16th Round, written while he was in prison, was published in 1974 by the Viking Press. The story inspired the 1975 Bob Dylan song Hurricane and the 1999 film The Hurricane with Denzel Washington playing Carter. From 1993 to 2005, Carter served as executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, later rebranded as Innocence Canada. In 2019, the case was the focus of a 13-part BBC podcast series, The Hurricane Tapes. The series was based on interviews which were conducted with survivors, case notes which were taken during the original investigations, and 40 hours of recorded interviews which were conducted with Carter by the author Ken Kolosky, who cited them in his 2011 book, The Eye of the Hurricane. Hurricane, Bob Dylan's howl of protest, still resonates today. The hard-hitting 1975 ballad tells the story of a black boxer framed in jail for murder. From the Financial Times, John Daly. Pistol shots rang out in the barroom night. The opening line of Bob Dylan's protest ballad, Hurricane, sounds more like the start of a classic noir thriller by Raymond Chandler. The song is one of Dylan's most detailed narratives, telling the story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, a black middleweight boxer who was framed by the police for a triple murder that took place in Paterson, New Jersey, bar in 1966. Dylan discovered the case in 1975 when Carter published his life story, The 16th Round. Intensely moved, the singer traveled to Rahway State Prison to visit the man who, in the words of the song, at one time could have been the champion of the world, but was now an innocent man living in hell. The resulting song was written fast, the collaborator Jacques Levy forming the powerful rhyming lyrics, which are unusual among Dylan's ballads for their clarity and structure. In a later interview, Levi said of his role, quote, "I think Dylan liked the idea that I could tell a story. Bob was not good at telling stories. He's got a lot of good stuff in his songs, but they don't usually end up to a story. Hurricane definitely adds up to a story. Specific, detailed, hard-hitting. It was recorded in the summer of 1975 with musicians from the Rolling Thunder Revue. notably Vinnie Bell on 12-string guitar, powerful drums, and percussion from Howie Wyeth and Luther Ricks, and the most memorably the brilliant gypsy-style violin of Scarlett Riviera, whose long, swooping musical lines lead a wild, exhilarating quality to the counterpoint, the harsh thump of the lyrics. But there were problems. Lawyers at Columbia Records fretted about possible lawsuits, especially from Arthur Dexter Bradley and Alfred Bello, the two white witnesses who, as the song vividly describes, were cajoled and threatened by the police into identifying Carter and his co-defendant, John Artis. A rewritten version had to be recorded, this time with Ronnie Blakely providing the vocal harmony. Even after its release as a single in November 1975 on the Desire album the following year, there was more legal trouble when Patty Valentine, another eyewitness named in the song, brought an unsuccessful lawsuit. Accusations of factual errors in the storytelling also dogged the ballad. Despite all that, it grabbed the public imagination, combining as it does the passionate rage against injustice in Dylan's protest songs, the feeling ashamed to be alive in a land where justice is just a game, with fuel for the race relations ferment of the time in its tale of two black men cynically framed and convicted by white cops, white witnesses, and an all-white jury. In December 1975, Dylan played a concert at New York's Madison Square Garden, raising $100,000 for Carter's defense. And whether or not it had anything to do with the song, in 1976, Carter and Artis were granted a new trial. This was unsuccessful, and it wasn't until 1985 that Carter was finally released from jail. A new judge ruling that the original prosecution had been based on racism rather than reason. By this time, Reuben Hurricane Carter had spent 19 years in jail. So let's take a look at the music video, Bob Dylan's Hurricane Carter. Okay, so let's take a look at the lyrics to the song, Hurricane Carter by Bob Dylan. And the song starts out with pistol shots ring out in the barroom night. Enter Patty Valentine from the upper hall. She sees the bartender in a pool of blood. Cries out, "My God, they killed them all." Here comes the story of the hurricane, the man the authorities came to blame for something that he'd never done. Put in a prison cell, but one time he could have been the champion of the world. 3 bodies lying there does Patty see, and another man named Bello moving around mysteriously. "I didn't do it," he said. He throws up his hands. "I was only robbing the register. I hope you understand." "I saw them leaving," he says, and he stops. "One of us had better call up the cops." And so Patty calls the cops, and they arrive on the scene with their red lights flashing in a hot New Jersey night. Meanwhile, far away in another part of town, Reuben Carter and a couple of friends are driving around. Number one contender for the middleweight crown. Had no idea what kind of expletive was about to go down. Then a cop pulled him over to the side of the road, just like the time before and the time before that. In Patterson, that's just the way things go. If you're black, you might as well not show up on the street unless you want to draw the heat. Alfred Bellow had a partner, and he had a rap for the cops. He and Arthur Dexter Bradley were just prowling around. He said, "I saw two men running out. They looked like middleweights. They jumped into a white car with out-of-state plates." And Miss Valentine just nodded her head. Cop said, "Wait a minute, boys. This one's not dead." So they took him to the infirmary. And though this man could hardly see, they told him that he could identify the guilty man. 4 a.m, they haul Reuben in, take him to the hospital, and they bring him upstairs. The wounded man looks up through one dying eye, says, "What you bring him in here for? He ain't the guy." Yes, that's the story of the hurricane. The man the authorities came to blame for something that he'd never done. Put in a prison cell, but one time could have been the champion of the world. 4 months later, the ghettos are in flame. Reuben's in South America fighting for his name, while Arthur Dexter Bradley's still in the robbery game, and the cops are putting the screws to him, looking for somebody to blame. Remember that murder that happened in a bar? Remember you said you saw the getaway car? You think you'd like to play ball with the law? Think it might have been a fighter that you saw running that night? Don't forget that you are white. Arthur Dexter Bradley said, "I'm not really sure." Cop said, "A poor boy like you could use a break. We gotta go for the hotel job, and we're talking to your friend Bello. Now, you don't want to have to go back to jail. Be a nice fellow. You're doing society a favor." Get that expletive. Is brave and getting braver. We want to put his ass in stir. We want to pin this triple murder on him. He ain't no gentleman Jim. Reuben could take out a man with just one punch, but he never did like to talk about it all that much. "It's my work," he says. "I do it for pay. And when it's over, I just as soon go my own way. Up to some paradise where the trout streams flow and the air is nice, and ride a horse along a trail." But they took him to the jailhouse, where they tried to turn a man into a mouse. All of Reuben's cards were marked in advance. The trial was a pig circus. He never had a chance. The judge made Reuben's witness drunkards from the slums. To the white folks who watched, he was a revolutionary bum. And to the black folks, he was just a crazy expletive. No one doubted that he pulled the trigger. And though he could not produce the gun, the DA said he was the one who did the deed. And the all-white jury agreed. Reuben Carter was falsely tried. The crime was murder 1. Guess who testified? Bellow and Bradley, and they both boldly lied. And the newspapers, they all went along for the ride. How can the life of such a man be in the palm of some fool's hand? To see him obviously framed couldn't help but make me feel ashamed to live in a land where justice is just a game. Now, all the criminals in their coats and their ties are free to drink martinis and watch the sunrise, while Reuben sits like Buddha in a 10-foot cell, an innocent man in a living hell. That's the story of the hurricane, but it won't be over until they clear his name and give him back the time he's done. Put in a prison cell, but one time he could have been the champion of the world. Okay, so those are the lyrics to the song Hurricane by Bob Dylan. Okay, let's take a look at the takeaway of today's lesson. We talked a little bit about the mystery of Marie Roget. It is a sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first murder mystery based on details of a real crime. We also took a look at the body of Roget, a perfume shop employee, is found in the River Seine in Paris, and the press takes a keen interest in the mystery. Dupin rejects the popular theory blaming the murder on a gang of ruffians seen in the area. Dupin further determines that a single murderer was involved, probably a sailor. Based upon the actual murder of Marie Cecilia Rogers, who worked in a tobacco shop, was known as the Beautiful Cigar Girl. The murder takes place in New York City, and her body was found floating in the Hudson River in New Jersey. The death of this well-known woman received national attention for weeks. Months later, the inquest still ongoing, her fiancé was found dead, an act of suicide. By his side, a remorseful note and an empty bottle of poison were found. Writing about Rogers as a sequel to the Murders in the Rue Morgue, Poe tried to solve the aforementioned enigma by creating a murder mystery. Fictionalizing actual events, especially murder, was common in this period of American literature. We talked at length about the Chevalier Auguste Dupin, the Murders in the Morgue, widely considered the first detective fiction story. Dupin is not a professional detective. Poe created the Dupin character before the word detective had been coined. The character laid the groundwork for fictional detectives to come, including Sherlock Holmes. Dupin is from what was a wealthy family. He now lives in Paris with his close friend, the anonymous narrator of the stories. Dupin shares some features with the later gentleman detective, a character type that became common in the golden age of detective fiction. The character depicted a reclusive man who prefers his own company and also prefers to work at night in the candlelight. He smokes a Mechlin pipe and even has a sidekick, just like Sherlock Holmes. Dupin is shown as a character that likes to stay away from the traditional ways of law enforcement, performing to develop his own techniques and innovative ways to solve mysteries. He believes that the French police way of investigating are stale and unoriginal. Pin views a crime scene as a scientist or mathematician by removing his emotions and looking at it objectively. He tries to gather all the tiny details and calculate the moves in the murder as one would in a chess game. We also talked about Pin as a well constructed and very enjoyable character. He has a was a reflection of the times and may even have been a nudge to the police that they need to work better. Pin, on the other hand, is portrayed as a dehumanizing thinking machine. Pin's method is to identify with the criminal and put himself in his mind. Pin's method also emphasizes the importance of reading and writing. Many of his clues come from newspapers or written reports from the prefect. The inspiration for the character of Dupin goes back to the French Minister of Police. Sherlock Holmes was one of several fictional detectives influenced by Dupin. Many tropes that would later become commonplace in detective fiction first appeared in Poe's stories. The eccentric but brilliant detective, the bumbling constabulary, the first person narrative by a close personal friend. We learn that Pin spends what little money he has on books. We had a real quick summary of the Purloined Letter. We talked about Bob Dylan's Hurricane Carter, who was a middleweight boxer, wrongfully convicted of murder, and later released following a petition serving almost 20 years in prison. Okay, so that is some of the takeaway for what we had today. That's it for today. We're almost out of time. So take a read, Mystery of Marie Roget, and we will talk about that more in detail in lesson 3. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you again next week. Bye.